In this podcast episode, host and guest Andrew Wilson engage in a wide-ranging and candid discussion about Christian ethics, political ideology, societal morals, culture, governance, and gender roles. Wilson, identifying as a Christian populist rather than a Christian nationalist, explains his worldview rooted in Christian ethics and its application to governance, social structure, and national identity. The conversation delves into topics such as the nature of morality, the role of law and government force, ideological divides in modern politics, cultural nationalism, immigration, reproductive issues, gender roles particularly related to voting and military draft, and the challenges posed by contemporary political discourse. Andrew Wilson asserts that Christian ethics produce the best societal outcomes, even for secular societies, and argues that Christians should ideally be in charge of political governance. He acknowledges that this position entails dominance by one group over others, justified on the basis of superior moral insight derived from Christian foundational beliefs. Wilson defends certain laws informed by Christian ethics, such as outlawing gay marriage and restricting government promotion of homosexual lifestyles, while also distinguishing between legal prohibition and personal immorality. He states that some immoral behaviors do not need to be criminalized, emphasizing a pragmatic approach focused on societal flourishing rather than stringent legislation against all perceived moral failings. Wilson further argues for promoting traditional family structures and values through public messaging and policy incentives as a means to uphold cultural and moral standards. The discussion moves into the philosophical foundations of morality, contrasting Christian moral realism with the anti-realism prevalent on the left. Wilson describes the left-wing worldview as lacking universal moral facts, embracing moral relativism or stance-dependent ethics, which he criticizes as logically inconsistent and leading to moral nihilism. This worldview, he contends, enables leftists to justify behaviors deemed immoral from a Christian perspective and engage in obfuscation and equivocation during debates. In contrast, right-wing thought, especially Christian ethics, holds that moral facts are universal and independent of individual stance, which legitimizes enforcing certain moral standards through law and governance. The ideological clash, according to Wilson, results in mutual vilification, with the right labeling the left immoral degenerates, while the left sees the right as oppressive totalitarians. Wilson articulates that politics fundamentally revolve around power and the legitimate use of force by the state to shape human behavior. He criticizes both extremes of the political spectrum, but particularly condemns the left for intellectual dishonesty and moral bankruptcy. The conversation identifies a race to power among competing ideologies, chiefly between Christian nationalism, populism, and resurgent forms of communism, socialism, particularly among young internet communities. Wilson views the rise of communism as a reactionary movement fueled by socio-economic frustrations and moral panic regarding perceived fascist threats. He challenges the idea that secular democracy or progressive politics operate purely on voluntary cooperation, asserting that enforcement and coercion are always required to realize political agendas. Wilson rejects mass migration, especially from non-Christian majority countries, asserting that cultural continuity grounded in Christian ethics is essential to national identity and societal health. He links cultural nationalism with the preservation of a heritage passed down through generations and expresses skepticism about the integration of migrants who do not share this cultural framework. The conversation highlights how demographic trends, such as low birth rates among native populations and higher fertility in immigrant communities, complicate this view. Wilson stresses the importance of raising domestic birth rates through family-centric policies rather than relying on immigration to maintain national vitality. The role of education in shaping societal values is examined, particularly in relation to teaching evolution versus creationism and the place of religious teachings in schools. Wilson advocates for teaching evolution as a scientifically supported theory, but also endorses educating children about the Bible within the context of religious studies, allowing students to form their own beliefs. He supports parental rights in academic decisions and opposes the inclusion of certain topics, such as explicit homosexual sex education, on the grounds that they may offend religious minorities. This highlights tensions between secular educational norms and religiously grounded worldviews in pluralistic societies. Wilson critiques the secular concept of rights as social constructs lacking real grounding outside divine authority. He insists that rights are effectively upheld or eroded through the application of force by governments, and that without a belief in objective moral facts, the concept of rights loses meaning. Government, in his view, exists primarily to compel behavior in line with a society's ethical standards. This perspective underpins his rejection of secular liberalism's emphasis on individual freedoms, which he sees as permissive and undermining of moral order. The podcast explores contentious issues surrounding gender, including voting rights and military service. Wilson questions the rationale and consistency of women's suffrage, arguing from a traditional viewpoint that women have disproportionate privileges, such as exemption from military draft, while still holding the power to vote on matters that can send men to war. He advocates for voting structures that prioritize households, potentially limiting women's individual suffrage and linking voting rights to responsibilities, such as military service or property ownership. The discussion considers biological and societal distinctions between men and women, recognizing that while women bear children, men bear the burden of combat. Wilson concedes the asymmetry, but calls attention to perceived imbalances in societal privileges and duties, advocating for a reconsideration of these arrangements with national interest in mind. A major concern for Wilson is the declining birth rates in Western societies and the societal consequences this entails. He advocates strongly for policies that incentivize earlier marriage and childbearing, especially encouraging women not to delay having children for educational or career pursuits. He supports extensive family support measures, including tax breaks and social incentives to raise domestic birth rates to sustainable levels. Wilson views family, rooted in Christian ethics, as the foundational unit of society and national continuity. He also connects these concerns to cultural and demographic preservation, contrasting native birth rates with those of immigrant populations. Throughout the episode, Wilson and the host emphasize the difficulty of engaging in meaningful political and moral discourse amid widespread polarization and ideological hostility. Wilson contrasts debating with progressive leftists, whom he regards as dishonest and evasive, with conversations with those holding opposing but principled views on the right, which he finds more grounded and genuine. The importance of understanding differing worldviews as lenses shaping meaning is stressed as a prerequisite for productive dialogue. The participants lament the current social media environment that amplifies extreme voices and obscures moderate perspectives, noting that most people hold nuanced views but are drowned out. Wilson clarifies that while he is not strictly a Christian nationalist, preferring the label Christian populist or cultural nationalist, his vision prioritizes Christian ethics as the foundation of law and public life. He explains that secularism's claim to fairness and neutrality is illusory because it inherently involves atheistic moral assumptions that lack objective grounding. He posits that Christian-informed governance leads to better outcomes, and that in the struggle between competing ideologies, Christian principles should prevail to ensure societal flourishing. Outlining a hypothetical scenario in which he governs, Wilson sets forth a platform emphasizing immediate cessation of mass migration, promotion of domestic childbirth, reinforcement of traditional family models, including discouraging delayed childbearing and prioritizing one-income families, regulation of media content to prevent exposure to what he terms degeneracy, and stricter controls on technology use by youth, such as smartphone restrictions. He rejects libertarianism and secular liberalism as enabling moral decay and envisions governance that actively shapes culture and behavior toward ethical flourishing grounded in Christian principles. Wilson expresses skepticism about direct democracy and universal suffrage as they currently exist, favoring a stakeholder democracy wherein voting rights are earned through property ownership, household status, or public service. He suggests raising the voting age and giving households a single vote to prevent fragmentation and reinforce social responsibility. Wilson acknowledges the historical contexts of voting rights and notes that societal structures and rights evolve while promoting a return to more traditional governance frameworks, emphasizing duty, hierarchy, and moral obligation. In closing, Andrew Wilson underlines the urgent need for society to address plummeting birth rates, which he views as critical to humanity's survival and flourishing. He identifies this demographic trend as foundational to all other societal concerns and urges greater public focus on policies and cultural norms that support larger families and encourage procreation within stable, ethical frameworks. This emphasis frames much of his broader argument for Christian-influenced governance and cultural nationalism as pathways to securing a sustainable future.